The crisp, expensive paper felt alien in my hands, cool and impossibly smooth. It was a stark white against the dark mahogany of his desk, a void waiting to be filled. He'd slid it across the polished surface with a gesture that was meant to be generous, perhaps even magnanimous. Instead, it landed with a thud that echoed the finality of a slammed door. "You can have anything you want, Eleanor," he'd said, his voice a low rumble, the same tone he used when discussing multi-million-dollar acquisitions. "Anything at all to facilitate your departure." His eyes, the color of a stormy sea, held a carefully constructed neutrality. No anger, no regret, just a detached assessment of a problem to be solved. And I, Eleanor Vance, was the problem. The errant variable in his meticulously ordered life. I traced the embossed lettering with a fingertip. "Pay to the order of" was printed in elegant script, followed by a blank line. Below it, "The sum of I's," and another blank line, trailing off into a vast empty space where numbers should have been. A blank check. A tangible representation of his desire to erase me, to scrub my existence from his meticulously curated world like an unsightly stain. The air in his study, usually thick with the scent of old leather and expensive cigar smoke, now felt thin and suffocating. Sunlight, usually a warm caress through the tall, arched windows, seemed to glint off the dust motes dancing in the charged atmosphere, each one a tiny shard of our shattered reality. My heart, a traitorous organ, hammered against my ribs. It wasn't a frantic beat of panic, but a deep, resonant thrum of something far more complex, a strange, almost perverse sense of power. He thought he was buying my silence, my compliance, my absence. He thought he was closing a chapter, neatly tying up loose ends. He had no idea he was handing me the pen to write a whole new book. "Anything?" I'd echoed, my voice a whisper, barely audible above the frantic pounding in my ears. He'd inclined his head, a subtle nod that confirmed it. "Anything, Eleanor. Just go. And don't look back." The words, meant to be a dismissal, landed like a benediction. Don't look back. That was the easiest part. Looking forward, however, was where the real challenge lay. And this check, this symbol of his perceived victory, was the key to unlocking that future. I picked it up, the paper feeling surprisingly substantial. His gaze followed my movement, a flicker of impatience in his stormy eyes. He expected me to fill in a number, a figure that would satisfy my perceived greed, my perceived desperation. He expected me to negotiate my exit, to haggle over the price of my dignity. But dignity had long since been bartered away in the quiet compromises, the unspoken resentments, the slow erosion of shared dreams. What remained was a raw, unvarnished truth, and the sudden, intoxicating freedom to finally speak it. My hand, steady despite the tremor that ran through my entire being, reached for the pen he'd placed beside the check. It was a Mont Blanc, heavy and cool, a tool of his trade, designed for signing away fortunes. Now, it was mine. He watched me, his jaw tight. I could see the wheels turning in his mind, calculating the potential cost. He was a man who dealt in figures, in quantifiable outcomes. He couldn't fathom a response that wasn't rooted in monetary value. I dipped the nib into the inkwell, the dark liquid swirling like a miniature storm. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, each tick a beat closer to a future I was about to forge. My eyes met his across the desk. He saw me, I knew, as a transaction. A regrettable but necessary expense. He saw the check as a tool of severance, a clean break. He was wrong. With a deliberate, almost theatrical flourish, I brought the pen to the line after "the sum of toins." My hand didn't waver. My heart, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, beat with a steady, resolute rhythm. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing, a question forming on his lips. But before he could speak, before he could impose his will or his expectations, I wrote. Not numbers, not a sum that could be tallied, debated, or regretted. I wrote a single, potent word. A word that encompassed the vastness of my newfound freedom, the depth of my disillusionment, and the absolute certainty of my departure. I wrote, forever. The ink bled slightly into the paper, a dark, indelible stain. It was a declaration, a pronouncement, a rebellion. It was my answer. His face, usually a mask of controlled composure, contorted. His eyes widened, disbelief warring with a dawning horror. The carefully constructed neutrality shattered, revealing the raw, primal shock beneath. What have you done?" he stammered, his voice hoarse, stripped of its usual authority. I smiled, a slow, genuine smile that reached my eyes. It was the first time I'd smiled like that in years. "I've accepted your offer, Robert," I said, my voice clear and strong, resonating in the cavernous room. "You gave me a blank check to leave, and I wrote 'forever' on it." I pushed the check back towards him, the ink still glistening. It wasn't a negotiation. It wasn't a plea. It was a statement of intent, a final, irrevocable act of liberation. He stared at the check, then at me, his face a road map of confusion and anger. He had expected me to be bought. He had expected me to be appeased. He had expected me to be gone, a quiet footnote in his illustrious life. He hadn't expected me to understand. He hadn't expected me to rewrite the terms of his dismissal. He hadn't expected me to claim my own ending, an ending that was not a surrender, but a victory. The air crackled with unspoken words, with the weight of years of unspoken truths. He had offered me a way out, a financial exit from a life that had become a gilded cage. I had taken it, but not in the way he intended. I had bought my freedom, not with his money, but with the profound realization that some departures are not meant to be temporary. Some endings are the truest beginnings. I stood up, the movement fluid and unhurried. The check lay between us, a testament to his miscalculation and my newfound resolve. He was a man of numbers, of tangible assets. He couldn't comprehend the value of an intangible, the immeasurable worth of a soul finally set free. "Thank you, Robert," I said, my voice soft, but laced with an unshakable conviction, "for everything." And then I turned and walked out of his study, out of his house, and out of the life we had built, leaving him with a blank check filled with a word he could never erase. A word that would forever define the end of our story and the beginning of mine. The sun, as I stepped out into the blinding light of day, felt warm on my skin, a promise of the endless horizons that now lay before me. The heavy oak door of his study clicked shut behind me, a sound far too delicate for the seismic shift it represented. It was a sound that should have been accompanied by the thunderous finality of a slammed portal. Yet it was merely a whisper, a polite dismissal. But the silence that followed was anything but polite. It was a vast, echoing expanse, a void waiting to be filled, not with the expected cacophony of his sputtering outrage, but with the quiet hum of my own emancipated breath. I stood for a moment in the opulent hallway, the plush carpet muffling my footsteps as if to further cushion Robert's ego from the jarring reality of my departure. The air, once thick with the scent of old leather and expensive cigar smoke, now felt impossibly clean, scrubbed free of the suffocating artifice that had characterized our shared existence. Sunlight, streaming through the tall, arched windows, seemed to glint off the dust motes dancing in the charged atmosphere, each one a tiny shard of our shattered reality. It illuminated the stark lines of the meticulously arranged furniture, the polished surfaces reflecting a world that was no longer mine to inhabit, not even as a decorative fixture. My hand, still faintly tingling from the phantom pressure of the Mont Blanc pen, tightened into a fist. The check, no longer a symbol of his control but a tangible representation of my defiance, was safely tucked into the inner pocket of my coat. It was a peculiar sensation, holding such immense, unquantifiable power in such a simple, folded piece of paper. He had offered me a sum, a quantifiable escape, a bartered freedom. I had given him the unvarnished truth, an absolute severance. Forever. The word, stark and bold against the pristine white of the check, felt like an indelible ink stain on the very fabric of his carefully constructed world. Beyond the imposing front doors, the blinding light of day beckoned. It was a stark contrast to the dim, controlled environment I was leaving behind, a world where every shadow was a deliberate placement, and every silence a carefully curated performance. I walked down the long gravel driveway, the crunching sound beneath my sensible shoes, a welcome counterpoint to the hushed reverence of his estate. Each step was a deliberate act of severance, a physical manifestation of my untethering. The manicured lawns, the ancient oak standing sentinel, the distant glint of his absurdly large fountain, all of it was a tableau of a life I had once believed was my destiny. Now it was simply scenery, a backdrop to the closing act of a play I had no desire to watch any longer. My destination was not a specific place, but rather a direction, a way. The car I had arranged, a discreet, nondescript sedan that felt blessedly ordinary, waited at the end of the road, a silent accomplice in my escape. The driver, a man whose face was as unreadable as the blank check had been, offered a curt nod as I approached. There was no preamble, no inquiry, just the quiet opening of the passenger door. As I settled into the worn leather seat, the scent of stale coffee, and something vaguely metallic, a welcome departure from the cloying perfume of his wealth, I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible exhale. It wasn't the breath of relief. Not yet. It was the breath of anticipation, of the exhilarating, terrifying unknown. He had given me a blank check to leave. I had written forever on it, and in doing so, I had not only bought my departure, but I had also purchased the infinite, unwritten expanse of my own future. The engine purred to life, a low, resonant hum that vibrated through the car, through me. It was a sound of motion, of progress, of leaving behind. I glanced back one last time, not at the imposing facade of the house, but at the distant silhouette of the study window, where I imagined Robert might still be standing, the check clutched in his hand, his stormy sea eyes widening with a dawning comprehension that was, perhaps, the only payment I truly desired to collect. He had expected me to name a price for my absence, to assign a monetary value to my silence. He had underestimated the immeasurable worth of my own self. The journey ahead was a blank canvas, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I held the brush. There was no script, no director, no audience demanding a performance. Just the open road, the steady rhythm of the engine, and the quiet, intoxicating promise of a life I would meticulously, deliberately, and irrevocably build for myself. The word forever on that check was not an ending, but a beginning. It was my declaration of independence, my solemn vow to myself, my benediction upon the life that had become a gilded cage. The miles dissolved behind us, each one a layer of the past shed. The landscape shifted, the manicured perfection of his estate giving way to the rugged, untamed beauty of the countryside. Trees, their branches reaching with wild abandon, replaced the sculpted hedges. The sky, vast and unbroken, stretched above us, a magnificent, uncurtained expanse. It was a stark, beautiful contrast to the suffocating intimacy of his world, a world where even the air felt meticulously filtered. My mind, freed from the constant low-grade anxiety of navigating his moods and expectations, began to buzz with possibilities. What would I do? Where would I go? The questions were not tinged with the despair of having no answers, but with the vibrant curiosity of a child presented with a treasure chest. I had always been a meticulous planner, a creature of habit and predictable outcomes. But this was different. This was a leap into the exhilarating void, a conscious choice to embrace the errant variables. I thought about the word I had written, forever. It was a commitment, yes, but not to him, and not to a place. It was a commitment to myself, a forever of possibility, a forever of self-discovery, a forever of finally breathing without the constant pressure of his gaze. It was a promise that I would never again allow myself to be bartered or dismissed, that my worth would not be dictated by a number on a printed slip of paper. The driver, sensing my shift in energy, offered a faint smile in the rearview mirror. It was a small gesture, but it felt like an acknowledgement, a silent understanding. We were both travelers, it seemed, on journeys away from something, towards something else. He, perhaps, was accustomed to facilitating departures, to being the silent witness of endings. I, however, was keenly aware that I was facilitating my own grand opening. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and bruised purple, a profound sense of peace settled over me. It wasn't the superficial calm of complacency, but the deep, resonant peace of conviction. I had made a choice, a bold, audacious choice that defied all expectations. I had taken the ultimate symbol of his transactional power and transformed it into the ultimate symbol of my liberation. He had given me a blank check. He had expected me to fill it with a sum that would erase me from his life, a quantifiable amount to facilitate my disappearance. He had envisioned me as a problem to be solved with a financial transaction, an inconvenient variable to be removed with magnanimous ease. He had failed to grasp that some things cannot be bought, some voids cannot be filled with mere currency, and some departures are not about the destination, but about the act of leaving itself. I had written forever on that check. It was a statement of absolute finality, a refusal to be a temporary inconvenience, a temporary acquisition. It was my way of saying that my exit was not a negotiation, not a temporary leave of absence, but a permanent, irrevocable severing. It was my declaration that I was no longer an errant variable in his meticulously curated world, but a force of nature, charting my own course. The car turned onto a different road, one that wound through rolling hills and past small, sleepy towns. Each signpost, each distant cluster of lights, represented a new direction, a new possibility. The weight I had carried for so long, the weight of expectation, of obligation, of unfulfilled potential, began to dissipate, replaced by a lightness that was almost intoxicating. I reached into my coat and pulled out the check again. The bold, black ink of forever seemed to shimmer in the dimming light. It was a masterpiece of defiance, a testament to my own quiet strength. I traced the word with my fingertip, a small smile playing on my lips. Robert had wanted to buy my silence. He had, in fact, bought my voice. He had given me a blank check, and I had written forever on it, signing away not a sum of money, but a lifetime of subservience. And as the car carried me further into the deepening twilight, I knew, with an unshakable certainty, that I had finally cashed in on the most valuable currency of all, my own freedom. The road ahead was unknown, unmarked, and entirely mine. The engine of the rented sedan hummed a low, steady tune, a stark contrast to the frantic thrumming that had once resided in my chest. Sunlight, no longer a muted guest through the arched windows of Robert's study, now poured in with a blinding, almost aggressive intensity, glinting off the dashboard and the endless ribbon of asphalt unspooling before me. Each mile devoured was another brick meticulously laid in the foundation of my new life, a life I was building not from the ashes of his disdain, but from the unvarnished, exhilarating truth of my own volition. The check, tucked securely into the inner pocket of my jacket, felt like a talisman, a tangible representation of an intangible freedom. It was an absurd, almost theatrical flourish, a gesture so profoundly outside the realm of Robert's transactional understanding that it had, paradoxically, become the most powerful tool in my arsenal. He had offered me a price for my absence, a quantifiable sum to facilitate my erasure from his meticulously curated world. Instead, I had bartered my future, not for money, but for the immutable certainty of no longer. The wind, whipping through the slightly ajar window, carried the scent of pine and something else, something wild and untamed, the smell of possibility. It was a heady perfume, intoxicating in its unfamiliarity. For so long, my existence had been a carefully constructed facade, reflecting the desires and expectations of others, a muted watercolor in Robert's vibrant, if sterile, landscape. Now, the canvas was mine, stark and white, waiting for the bold strokes of my own design. I remembered the precise moment the ink had flowed from the Mont Blanc pen, a dark liquid swirling like a miniature storm in its reservoir. It had felt like a defiance, a whispered rebellion against the suffocating silence that had characterized our interactions. His meticulously neutral expression had fractured for a fleeting instant, a roadmap of confusion and anger briefly etched onto his otherwise impassive features. He had expected a figure, a negotiation, a clear monetary value to be assigned to my departure. He had not anticipated, nor could he possibly comprehend, the immeasurable worth I placed on simply leaving. The word forever wasn't just a declaration of my permanent exit. It was a reclamation of my own narrative. It was the ultimate dismissal of his narrative, the one where I was an errant variable, an inconvenience to be smoothed over, purchased, and forgotten. It was the antithesis of his carefully constructed reality, a testament to the fact that some things, some freedoms, could not be bought. They could only be claimed. I navigated the winding roads with a growing sense of ease. The rental car, a nondescript model that offered no hint of my former life, felt surprisingly comfortable. Its very anonymity was a form of liberation. I was no longer Eleanor Vance, the woman associated with Robert Sterling, the woman who occupied his sprawling estate and his even more sprawling indifference. I was simply Eleanor, a woman with a full tank of gas and a horizon stretching out before her, unburdened by expectation or obligation. My mind, however, was not entirely at ease. It was a landscape now cleared of one dominant, suffocating presence, but still a landscape that needed tending. The void he had intended for me, a void waiting to be filled with his magnanimous severance package, was now a space I had to actively fill with my own substance. The check was the catalyst, the permission slip, but the work of building a life, a real life, was still ahead. I thought of the small, discreet deposit I had made into a new, untraceable account weeks ago, a contingency plan born from a gnawing intuition that this day would come. It wasn't a substantial sum, not by Robert's standards, but it was mine. It was the seed money for my independence, a tangible representation of my intent to survive and eventually to thrive on my own terms. The check, with its audacious inscription, was the ultimate insurance policy, a guaranteed severance from the past that would prevent any future attempt at reconciliation, or worse, a paternalistic reacquisition. As I drove, the landscape began to shift. The dense forests gave way to rolling hills, then to a flatter, more open terrain. The sky seemed to expand, a vast cerulean dome stretching to impossible distances. It was as if the world itself was breathing a sigh of relief, mirroring the release I felt in my own soul. There were moments, fleeting and unwelcome, when the ghost of his voice, that low, resonant rumble, would echo in my mind. He had spoken with such practiced detachment, as if discussing the weather or the stock market, when he had presented the check. "Consider it a facilitation," he'd said, his eyes the color of a stormy sea, never quite meeting mine. "A means to facilitate your departure. Whatever you require." He had believed he held all the cards, that he could simply write a check to alleviate any inconvenience. But he had underestimated the power of a word. He had underestimated the power of finality. He hadn't considered that the blank space on the check wasn't just an invitation for a number, but an invitation for a statement. And my statement was unequivocal. I pulled into a small, unassuming diner, the kind with faded red vinyl booths and the comforting aroma of coffee and fried onions. Stepping out of the car, I stretched, feeling the unfamiliar freedom in my limbs. The air here was different, less polished, less perfumed with expensive cigar smoke. It was the air of ordinary lives, of people who worried about bills and weekend plans, not about the strategic acquisition of assets. Inside, I ordered a black coffee, strong and hot. The waitress, a woman with kind eyes and a weary smile, didn't ask my name. She just brought the coffee and a newspaper, folded open to the crossword. I didn't bother with it. My mind was too occupied with the grander puzzle I was solving. The check, I knew, would eventually be presented. It would be a surreal moment, a final, bizarre transaction. I imagined his surprise, his frustration, perhaps even a flicker of grudging respect for the sheer audacity of it. But it wouldn't matter. By the time he processed the implications, I would be too far gone, too irrevocably free. The initial shock of his offer had quickly morphed into something else. It was a dawning awareness, a spark igniting in the quiet corners of my being. He had handed me a blank check, yes, but he had also, inadvertently, handed me the pen. He had offered me the means to purchase my exit, but I had used it to inscribe my liberation. I sipped the coffee, its bitterness a welcome contrast to the cloying sweetness of my former life. This was not an escape. It was an arrival into myself. The path ahead was unwritten, the challenges unknown, but the fear that had once been a constant companion had receded, replaced by a quiet, resolute conviction. I had taken his attempt to buy me off and turned it into my own declaration of independence. I had written "forever" on his blank check, and in doing so, I had finally begun to write my own story. The road stretched on, and for the first time, it felt like it was truly mine to travel. The check, now irrevocably marked, felt impossibly smooth beneath my fingertips as I tucked it into the inner pocket of my tailored blazer. It was a tangible representation of an intangible freedom, a promise I had forged myself. The mahogany desk, once a monument to Robert's dominion, now seemed like a mere prop in a play that had finally concluded. His study, with its suffocating scent of old leather and expensive cigar smoke, had been the gilded cage, and I had just been handed the key. The drive away from the estate was a blur of blinding light and the endless beckoning horizons. Each mile that stretched between me and that imposing stone edifice was a testament to my burgeoning independence. The air, thick with the promise of an unwritten future, filled my lungs, a stark contrast to the stale, controlled atmosphere I had inhabited for so long. The car, a sleek, unfamiliar rental, felt like an extension of my newfound agency, its engine a low, resonant hum that echoed the quiet triumph in my soul. I hadn't meticulously planned this. The act of writing "forever" had been an impulse, a visceral rejection of his transactional worldview. He offered a void, a space he wanted filled with my absence, and I had filled it with a concept far grander, far more absolute than any sum of money. My heart, a traitorous organ that had beat in time with his carefully constructed neutrality for years, now pulsed with a wild, exhilarating rhythm. It was a symphony of liberation, a stark departure from the monotonous drone of compliance. The initial destination was less a choice and more a surrender to instinct. I drove south, letting the highway lines dictate my path, my mind a whirlwind of possibilities. No longer tethered by expectation or obligation, the world unfurled before me like a meticulously curated map, each possibility a vibrant, unexplored territory. I thought of the places I had only ever seen in glossy magazines, the cities whispered about in hushed tones by those who had escaped their own gilded cages. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in hues of fire and amethyst, I found myself pulling into a small, unassuming town nestled beside a shimmering lake. It was the antithesis of the sprawling grandeur I had left behind. Here, the houses were modest, the sidewalks worn smooth by generations of footsteps, and the air carried the gentle scent of pine and damp earth. It was a place where people likely knew each other by name, where life moved at a rhythm dictated by the sun and the seasons, not by stock market fluctuations. I booked a room at a small inn, its walls adorned with faded floral wallpaper and the air thick with the comforting aroma of brewing coffee. The proprietor, a woman with kind eyes and a smile that crinkled at the corners, barely glanced at my identification. It was a refreshing anonymity, a welcome absence of scrutiny. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I was not Eleanor Vance, the appendage, the errant variable, the problem to be solved. I was simply a traveler, a woman seeking respite. That night, I sat by the window, the check resting on the bedside table. It was no longer just a piece of paper. It was a testament to my own agency, a stark reminder that I held the pen, the power, the capacity to define my own terms. Robert had given me a way out, but he had underestimated the depth of my desire for a true escape, for a permanence that money could not quantify. He had offered to buy my silence, but I had bartered for my soul. The next few days were a gentle unfolding. I explored the town, walked along the lake, and allowed the quietude to seep into my bones. I ate at a small diner where the waitress knew everyone's order by heart, and the coffee was perpetually refilled without asking. I bought a cheap, spiral-bound notebook and a simple pen, and for the first time in years, I began to write. Not about Robert, not about the life I had left behind, but about the intangible feelings that stirred within me. The nascent hope, the quiet resilience, the unvarnished truth of my own desires. I realized that Robert's magnanimous gesture, intended to facilitate my dismissal, had instead facilitated my acquisition of self. He had sought to erase me, to scrub my existence from his meticulously curated world like an unsightly stain. But in doing so, he had inadvertently handed me the tools to rebuild myself, to craft a narrative that was entirely my own. The blank check, a symbol of his control, had become the very instrument of my emancipation. One afternoon, I sat at a small cafe overlooking the lake, the notebook open before me. The sunlight, diffused by the rippling water, seemed to glint off the dust motes dancing in the charged atmosphere, each one a tiny shard of our shattered reality. I reached for the pen, not the Mont Blanc that Robert had once gifted me, a symbol of his own perceived importance, but a simple, functional Bic. I began to sketch, not a grand design, but the outline of a small cottage nestled amongst trees, with smoke curling lazily from its chimney. It was a nascent dream, a tangible representation of the life I was beginning to envision. The check remained in my blazer pocket, a constant, quiet reminder. I knew Robert would eventually discover my inscription. I imagined his reaction, the bewildered disbelief, the simmering anger, the perverted sense of amusement at my defiance. He would be accustomed to quantifiable results, to transactions that adhered to his rigid logic. Forever was an abstract, immeasurable concept, a variable he couldn't possibly comprehend. It was a dismissal of his power, an assertion that my departure was not a matter of negotiation, but of finality. I wasn't seeking revenge, though a part of me relished his inevitable frustration. My true aim was liberation, a complete and utter severing of ties. The word forever was not just about leaving his life. It was about embracing an eternity of my own making. It was a benediction for myself, a commitment to a future unburdened by his expectations or his wealth. As the weeks turned into months, I moved from the inn to a small rented apartment in a town a little further north, a place with a thriving arts community and a palpable sense of bohemian spirit. I found work at a small independent bookstore, surrounded by the comforting scent of paper and ink. My days were filled with the quiet rhythm of shelving books, recommending stories to strangers, and the satisfying weight of a full day's honest labor. The check remained, a treasured artifact, tucked away in a small wooden box I had purchased at a local antique shop. It was a reminder of the moment I had seized control, the moment I had transformed a symbol of my subjugation into a declaration of my freedom. Robert had given me a blank check to leave, and I had written "forever" on it. Not as a threat, but as a promise. A promise to myself, to live a life that was authentically my own. A life that stretched out before me, vast and full of an immeasurable, unquantifiable promise. The void he had intended for me had become a fertile ground for my own becoming, and I was finally ready to plant the seeds. The heavy oak door of Robert's study clicked shut behind me, the sound impossibly soft, a mere whisper against the thunder of my own heart. I stood in the hushed hallway, the embossed stationery and the Mont Blanc pen still clutched in my hand, a tangible representation of an intangible victory. The air, thick with the scent of old leather and expensive cigar smoke, seemed to recede, replaced by a bracing coolness that seeped from the outside world. Robert's reaction had been a masterpiece of controlled bewilderment. The carefully constructed neutrality of his expression had fractured, just for a flicker, revealing a roadmap of confusion and anger beneath the polished veneer. He had stared at the check, at the single stark word I had scrawled across the void he'd offered, as if I'd presented him with an alien artifact. "Forever," I had written, the ink a deep, resonant black, swirling like a miniature storm on the crisp, expensive paper. It wasn't an amount, not in his sterile, quantifiable terms. It was an epoch, a definitive end, a benediction of absolute dismissal. He had stammered, a low rumble that usually commanded attention, but now sounded pathetically bereft of its usual authority. "What? What is this, Eleanor?" I had met his gaze, the stormy sea of his eyes now churning with a tempest of his own making. "It's my answer, Robert. It's my final bid. It's the end of my compliance." My voice, which I'd feared would betray me with a tremor, had emerged clear and strong, carrying an unvarnished conviction that surprised even myself. He had run a hand over his immaculately coiffed hair, a gesture of agitation I hadn't seen in years. "You don't understand. This is a settlement, a financial arrangement. You're supposed to name a sum. Something reasonable." "Reasonable," I'd echoed, a ghost of a smile playing on my lips. "What is reasonable, Robert, when one is bartering away a life? When one is severing ties that were meant to be unbreakable?" I gestured to the check, to the word that had so utterly confounded him. "This is my valuation. This is my irrevocability. This is me taking my leave, not for a period, not until I find something better, but unequivocally. Forever." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the rhythmic tick of the grandfather clock in the hall, each beat a hammer blow against the fragile edifice of his control. He had looked at the check again, then at me, his eyes narrowing as if trying to decipher a complex equation. He couldn't fathom it. He couldn't quantify it. My departure wasn't a transaction to be settled. It was a statement of being. He had ultimately folded, not with grace, but with a grudging, almost imperceptible nod. "Very well, Eleanor. As you wish." The words were clipped, devoid of emotion, a dismissal cloaked in formality. He had simply handed me the pen, an act of surrender disguised as magnanimity. Now, standing in the hallway, the check tucked safely into the inner pocket of my coat, I felt a lightness I hadn't experienced in years. The weight of expectation, the suffocating pressure of being Robert Vance's consort, had lifted. The house, once a gilded cage, now felt like a museum exhibit I was free to wander through one last time before stepping out into the blinding light of day. I walked through the grand rooms, each object meticulously curated, each surface polished to an impossible sheen. The expensive art, the antique furniture, the hushed opulence that had once represented security and status now felt hollow, like stage props in a play where I was no longer an actress. I didn't linger. There was no need to pack, no possessions of value to claim. Everything he valued, he could keep. My true possessions were intangible: the memories, the lessons learned, and the unshakable resolve hardening within me. Stepping out of the imposing front door, the crisp autumn air was a caress against my skin. The sky was a vast, cerulean expanse, dotted with fluffy white clouds that drifted with an apparent lack of purpose, a stark contrast to the rigid order of Robert's world. I took a deep, cleansing breath, filling my lungs with the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke. My car, a sensible sedan that had always felt a little out of place parked beside Robert's fleet of luxury vehicles, was waiting for me in the driveway. As I opened the door, I glanced back at the imposing mansion, a monument to his wealth and my erstwhile confinement. There was no regret, only a quiet sense of closure. The engine purred to life, a familiar, comforting sound. I pulled out onto the long, winding drive, the gravel crunching beneath my tires. I didn't have a destination in mind, not a specific city or town. My only direction was forward. The check, the symbol of my liberation, was tucked securely, a constant reminder of the choice I had made. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a declaration. It was the key to an unlocked door, a door I myself had opened with a single, audacious word. The miles melted away. The landscape shifted from manicured estates to rolling farmland, then to the sparse beauty of undeveloped wilderness,